Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into an odd fear that plagued Europeans back in the 18th century. Imagine it's night and you're exhausted after a long day. You're about to curl up in bed, the sheets cool and crisp. But wait, what if there was no mattress? Just a wooden frame and maybe a layer of straw, maybe not. The fear of beds without mattresses was something that haunted the minds of many in Europe. And it wasn't just a quirky superstition. It was a very real concern. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm curious to know where you're tuning in from tonight, so feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Now, let's get back to the bed, specifically the absence of a mattress. It might sound ridiculous to us, right? You probably won't survive this, but bear with me. Picture it. You walk into a wealthy household in 18th century Europe. There's no bed like the one you sleep in now. No plush mattress, no feather pillows. Instead, you're faced with a wooden bed frame, maybe a thin straw mattress, or, if you're unlucky, just a pile of rags. That's the kind of bed that kept Europeans up at night. In an era where comfort wasn't quite the priority it is today, people feared more than just an uncomfortable night's sleep. They feared what slept with them: pests, illness, even death. Historians still debate whether the fear of bare beds was more about the anxiety surrounding hygiene or the superstition that these beds attracted danger. What we know for sure is that the idea of sleeping without a proper mattress was wrapped up in fear of sickness. It was the 18th century, and while the world was changing rapidly, many old fears still loomed large. There were no such things as memory foam or luxury mattresses back then, just the bare bones of a bed. You might think it's all a bit dramatic. After all, how dangerous could a bed really be? Well, as it turns out, quite a lot. Let's explore why this seemingly innocuous piece of furniture could be so terrifying. In the 18th century, Europe was undergoing a period of great change, with new wealth and new fears accompanying it. Beds, once a luxury reserved for the nobility, had slowly begun to spread throughout society. However, this change in access to beds also brought with it something that would make you shudder today: the fear of sleeping without a mattress. You might think that a mattress, simple as it seems, wouldn't carry such a heavy weight of dread. But back then, it was a symbol of safety, health, and social status. The wealthier you were, the more comfortable and cleaner your bed. But for the common folk, a bed without a mattress was more than just uncomfortable. It was a dangerous place to sleep. As the aristocracy began to acquire more elaborate furniture, including their grand beds, the status associated with them grew. Wealthy individuals didn't just sleep. They lounged in comfort, surrounded by luxurious fabrics, rich woods, and yes, large mattresses stuffed with feathers or wool. In contrast, the poor often made do with straw or thin linen, which barely provided enough insulation from the cold wooden frame underneath. This disparity in bedding became a reflection of the stark divide between classes. However, it wasn't just the comfort that made the mattress such a prized possession. A mattress provided a layer of protection, both literal and figurative. You see, beds without mattresses were often filled with something much less comfortable: straw. Straw was cheap, and it was often used as filler in beds for commoners. But straw wasn't just uncomfortable, it was also a breeding ground for pests, including lice, fleas, and bed bugs. And if that wasn't enough, straw beds also came with a very real health risk. In a world where personal hygiene was still rudimentary, sleeping on straw, especially in damp conditions, could result in various skin conditions, infections, and even more deadly diseases. Historians still argue about the exact cause of these fears. Some say it was the diseases that flourished in these unsanitary sleeping conditions, while others believe that the superstitions surrounding cleanliness and purity played a larger role. Regardless, the fear was tangible, and many Europeans would do anything to avoid the discomfort and health hazards that came with sleeping on straw or other makeshift bedding. In fact, some even resorted to desperate measures to avoid sleeping in such conditions, like not sleeping at all or sleeping in shifts, so that one person could stay awake and watch for danger. Now, let's turn our attention to another terrifying aspect of the bed situation in 18th century Europe, the ever-present fear of fire. You might wonder how something as seemingly innocent as a bed could become the cause of so much anxiety. But back then, the very idea of a bed without a mattress was enough to set off alarm bells in people's minds. Because without that mattress, the risk of fire skyrocketed. The truth is, most of these poor, unsophisticated beds were made of straw, and straw is highly flammable. You might not think much of it today, but imagine this. In an age before modern fire safety, the combination of straw, candles, and the constant use of open flames to heat homes made a deadly mix. A single spark could easily ignite a bed, turning it into an inferno in minutes. And the worst part? You might not even realize the danger until it was too late. In fact, many tragic fires were caused by this very scenario: beds catching fire from a stray ember, a dropped candle, or a spark from the hearth. Fires weren't just a risk to people in lower classes either. Even those who slept in the comfort of more luxurious beds had to contend with the ever-present danger of fire. You see, it wasn't just straw that was flammable. Mattresses, especially those made of feathers or wool, could catch fire just as easily. The flames would spread quickly, consuming not only the bedding, but the entire room in a horrifying instant. Imagine waking up in the dead of night, realizing the bed beneath you is burning and having no way to escape. This was a very real fear that Europeans in the 18th century had to live with. Historians still debate whether the fear of fires had a more significant impact on the way people slept, or whether the health risks associated with dirty, straw-filled beds were the driving force behind people's anxieties. But one thing's certain: those who lived in an age of rampant fire danger were particularly cautious about their sleeping arrangements. Even the slightest risk of fire could result in the loss of everything: your home, your belongings, and most terrifying of all, your life. This fear of fire didn't just lead to a paranoid approach to bed-making. It also led to a variety of precautions. People would sometimes surround their beds with fireproof materials, or even sleep with a bucket of water beside them, ready to douse any potential flames that might arise. It may sound extreme, but for many, it was a necessary precaution. But it wasn't just fire that kept 18th century Europeans awake at night. Bedbugs, lice, and fleas were constant companions of those who slept on bare beds. And for many, these pests were the true terror of the night. It might sound like an exaggeration to us now, but the fear of these creepy crawlies was very real in the 18th century. And it often came with much more than just itchy bites. For the lower classes, a bed without a mattress was an open invitation to an infestation. You see, when mattresses were still a luxury, the wealthy had their beds professionally made, with carefully crafted coverings that provided some degree of protection from pests. But for the common folk who slept on straw or thin linen, the story was very different. These materials were ideal homes for all sorts of bugs, from the infamous bed bugs to lice that would crawl in the hair and leave their marks on the skin. And once a bed became infested, it was nearly impossible to get rid of the pests. Bed bugs in particular were a major concern, and the fear surrounding them wasn't just about the discomfort they caused. They were also vectors for disease, And in a world without antibiotics or modern medicine, a simple bedbug bite could lead to a deadly infection. Lice, too, were more than just a nuisance. Lice infestations were often linked to poor hygiene and unsanitary living conditions, which in turn contributed to the spread of other diseases like typhus. The psychological toll of knowing you were sleeping in an environment that was teeming with these parasites was enough to make anyone dread bedtime. Historians still argue about whether the fear of pests or the threat of disease was the greater cause of anxiety in 18th century Europe. Some suggest that people feared the social stigma of being seen as unclean, while others believed that the very real threat of infection was the driving force. Either way, the fact remains that the prospect of going to sleep with bugs and parasites crawling around you was enough to make even the bravest souls hesitate before lying down. To combat this, many Europeans would take drastic measures. People used everything from herbal remedies to chemicals like sulfur to try to keep the pests at bay. The wealthy would even have their beds fumigated regularly, often with incense or burning aromatic herbs, in an effort to drive out the bugs. But for those without the resources to afford such luxuries, the reality was far grimier. They were stuck with the pests, enduring sleepless nights and constant scratching, all while trying to fend off the creeping feeling that their bed was a haven for disease. As if the bedbugs and fleas weren't bad enough, there was an even deeper layer to the fear surrounding 18th century beds. Superstitions, those ancient and bizarre beliefs, still held a powerful grip on people's imaginations, especially when it came to something as intimate as a bed. You might be wondering how something as everyday as sleeping could trigger a string of supernatural anxieties, but the truth is that people at the time believed that beds could attract more than just pests. They could attract bad omens and evil spirits. In the 18th century, sleep was not merely about rest. It was an act of vulnerability, a moment when the body and mind were in a state of relative helplessness. And in an era still very much influenced by medieval beliefs, it was thought that spirits could invade that moment of stillness. Beds, especially those without the protection of a mattress, were seen as places where evil could more easily take hold. The old medieval superstitions about spirits lurking in dark corners of the house were often projected onto the bed. Without a thick mattress or proper bedding, it was believed that the soul could be more easily disturbed or even taken by malevolent forces. Moreover, there was a particular superstition that those who slept on bare straw, or in a bed without any cushion or mattress, would attract bad luck. It was thought that the lack of proper bedding might lead to restless sleep, which, in turn, would bring about nightmares or, worse, cause physical harm. People who slept on straw were believed to be inviting illness and misfortune, perhaps even death. Imagine being told that your very bed could be the cause of your downfall, not because of comfort or hygiene, but because it didn't offer the proper protection from the unseen world. Historians still debate whether these superstitions were merely a reflection of the people's desperate desire for control over the uncontrollable, or if they had roots in ancient religious beliefs that were still prevalent in Europe. What we do know is that the fear of bad omens associated with unprotected sleep was more than just an idle fear. It was a powerful force that shaped how people viewed their beds, their safety, and even their fates. The sheer anxiety surrounding these beliefs led to a number of odd rituals and precautions. Some people would sprinkle herbs or salt around their beds to ward off evil spirits, while others would sleep with objects like holy symbols or charms to ensure they were protected during the vulnerable hours of the night. Even the design of the bed itself played a role in these superstitions. The canopy bed, with its heavy curtains, became a popular choice not just for comfort, but to create a sense of separation from the malevolent forces lurking in the darkness. It was as though these fabrics and cushions, often luxurious and grand, could create a safe barrier between the sleeper and the supernatural world. Now, let's delve deeper into how these fears were compounded by something far more sinister: disease. In a world still reeling from the traumatic memories of the Black Death, Europeans in the 18th century were hyper-aware of how easily disease could spread, even within the confines of one's own bed. You might think of the Black Death as a distant, historical event, but its shadow still loomed large over the minds of people living centuries later. The fear of contamination, infection, and pestilence made the idea of a bed without a mattress even more terrifying. The bubonic plague, which had devastated Europe in the 14th century, was not just a historical curiosity, it was a recent memory for many. And as Europe slowly recovered from the trauma of that era, the idea of unclean, unsanitary sleeping arrangements seemed like an open invitation for the plague to return. People became obsessed with cleanliness, perhaps a little too much. In fact, this obsession sometimes led to an overreaction, where anything considered dirty or unclean was deemed potentially deadly. The poor, especially, were left to sleep in the most unsanitary conditions, often on straw or cloth mattresses that were difficult, if not impossible, to clean. Add to this the issue of public hygiene. There were no modern sanitation systems, and waste disposal was often crude, leaving streets littered with refuse. This environment was perfect for disease to spread, and any small lapse in cleanliness could result in a deadly epidemic. Historians still argue over whether the fear of disease was more about the public's awareness of their susceptibility to infections, or whether it was the ongoing paranoia of another plague resurgence. But the threat of disease was not just theoretical. It was a very real concern. Poor sleep hygiene could leave a person vulnerable to all sorts of illnesses. And for those who slept without a mattress, the dampness of the straw beds provided a perfect breeding ground for bacteria and fungi. This wasn't just a minor discomfort. It was a potential death sentence. Skin diseases, respiratory issues, and even fatal infections could spread in these unsanitary environments. The wealthy, on the other hand, weren't immune from these fears, but they had the luxury of better access to clean bedding, regular washing, and professional care. The difference in hygiene between the upper and lower classes created a distinct divide, not only in comfort, but in health. The fear of contamination didn't just apply to the poor. It was an anxiety that all classes shared, albeit to different extents. Even the most luxurious feather mattresses could harbor germs if they weren't maintained properly. In fact, some wealthier Europeans took drastic measures to ensure their beds were as clean as possible. Some would have their beds fumigated. Others would use special powders and sprays to keep bugs at bay. And many even kept their sleeping areas separate from other parts of the house to limit exposure to disease. But for the lower classes, the reality was much grimmer. With limited resources, they had no choice but to sleep in filthy, poorly maintained bedding. This exposure to germs, bacteria, and pests only added to the ever-present fear that their beds were slowly killing them. The anxiety that gripped them at night was palpable. Sleeping wasn't just an act of rest. It was an act of submission to the potential of illness. Imagine a world where the simple act of lying down to sleep could fill you with dread, not only because of the uncomfortable straw beneath you, but because of the very stench that clung to the air. That's the reality 18th century Europeans faced when they crawled into their beds. The fear of an unsanitary bed was compounded by the putrid smell of decay and illness that permeated the air in many homes. We're talking about more than just the rank odor of unwashed bodies or dirty linens. No, this was the smell of sickness, the kind of odor that made your stomach churn and your skin crawl. In an age without proper sewage systems, with waste often disposed of in open pits or simply thrown out into the streets. The air inside even the wealthiest homes was far from clean. And where do you think much of that air ended up? Right into the bed. When you sleep, you breathe in the air around you, and in the 18th century, that meant inhaling whatever germs, bacteria, and foul odors hung in the air. For the wealthy, their beds may have been fresher, but they still dealt with the pervasive smell of city life, particularly in densely populated areas where hygiene was minimal. But for the poor, well, the odor of death and decay was an almost constant companion. What made matters worse was that the smell often came from the bed itself. Straw mattresses, if they weren't aired out and regularly cleaned, would begin to rot. Over time, the material would become saturated with the dampness from the ground and the sweat of the person sleeping on it. This created a breeding ground for bacteria, fungi, and mold. It didn't just smell bad, it made people sick. Respiratory issues, skin rashes, and even more serious infections were all linked to the unsanitary conditions of beds. The smell was not just a nuisance, it was a warning, a sign that something far more dangerous was lurking beneath the surface. Historians still argue whether the fear of the smell was more psychological, linked to the trauma of plagues, or whether it was driven by the real health threats of poor hygiene. Regardless of the cause, one thing is clear. The bed, as a place of rest, had become a place of dread. It was the smell of sickness, the smell of decay, and in many cases, the smell of death. Even the wealthier classes had their issues with smell, and the desperate measures they took to combat it revealed just how deep the anxiety went. People would sleep with windows open, even in the coldest months, or burn incense to mask the unpleasant odors. Some even resorted to keeping their beds raised off the floor to avoid the humidity and dampness that caused mold and rot. It's hard to imagine how pervasive this fear of smell and sickness must have been. For many Europeans, a bed without a mattress wasn't just a source of discomfort. It was a source of constant unease, where every night felt like a potential encounter with death itself. When you finally closed your eyes and settled into your bed, it wasn't just about rest. It was about survival. And sometimes, survival meant holding your breath and hoping that sleep didn't bring sickness along with it. As we move further into the 18th century, the fear surrounding unmattressed beds only deepened as concerns about public health grew. While Europe was still coming to terms with the horrors of past plagues, new diseases were emerging, adding fuel to the fire of fear and anxiety surrounding the sleeping conditions of the time. The rise of epidemics like smallpox, typhus, and various fevers in densely populated cities made people hyper-aware of how easily diseases could spread. In this context, the humble bed became more than just a place to sleep. It became a breeding ground for sickness, particularly for those who couldn't afford a mattress. Poor hygiene and unsanitary conditions were rampant, particularly in urban centers. Cities like London, Paris, and Amsterdam were growing rapidly during this period, and with that growth came overcrowding. The streets were filthy, the sewers often overflowed, and disease was a constant threat. The spread of illness was exacerbated by the fact that many people slept in cramped, poorly ventilated spaces, often on straw or rags, which were perfect havens for germs and bacteria. Even the more fortunate, those with access to better living conditions, couldn't escape the creeping fear that disease could slip into their lives through their very beds. The fear of epidemics was palpable. Historians still debate whether the growing anxiety over public health was purely a product of the period's experience with disease, or if it was influenced by the emerging rational thought of the Enlightenment, which encouraged people to think more scientifically about health and hygiene. Some scholars argue that this shift in thinking helped fuel the widespread fear of sleeping without a proper mattress. because it wasn't just superstition or ignorance at play anymore. It was the understanding that diseases could be transmitted through unsanitary conditions, and a mattress, with its ability to protect the sleeper from the floor and its potential for cleanliness, became a symbol of health. The growing awareness of hygiene in the 18th century led to changes in bedding practices. The wealthy continued to invest in elaborate beds with mattresses stuffed with feathers, wool, or horsehair, and some even began to use special fabrics to protect their mattresses from contamination. In contrast, the poor were often left to sleep in conditions that made them vulnerable to disease. There were no hospitals for the lower classes, and without proper access to medical care, a simple infection could quickly turn deadly. The connection between cleanliness, disease, and the bed became a key focus in the ongoing debate about public health, further entrenching the fear of unprotected sleep. The plight of the common folk in 18th century Europe paints a grim picture of the challenges faced by those who slept on bare, unprotected beds. For the wealthy, it was a matter of status and comfort, but for the poor, it was a matter of survival. Without the luxury of mattresses, many were forced to make do with what they could find: straw, cloth, or whatever scraps they could afford. These makeshift beds, while somewhat functional, were fraught with dangers, and the absence of a mattress wasn't just about comfort. It was a stark reminder of social inequality. For the lower classes, the struggle was not only about finding a place to sleep, but about finding a space that wouldn't contribute to their deterioration. The dampness and coldness of straw beds made them prime environments for the growth of bacteria, fungi, and other pathogens, and the poor were often forced to share beds, sometimes with multiple family members or even with strangers. This not only increased the likelihood of spreading disease, but it also meant that the same unsanitary conditions persisted night after night. Historians still argue whether the social inequalities in bedding were the result of economic factors or if they were part of a larger system of class-based exploitation. While the wealthy had access to clean, well-maintained beds that protected them from disease, the poor were left to suffer in the filth and discomfort of their straw-filled mattresses. The fact that the lower classes had little choice but to sleep in these unsanitary conditions only exacerbated the deepening divide between the rich and the poor. In many ways, the lack of a proper mattress became a symbol of poverty and vulnerability. It wasn't just a matter of uncomfortable sleep, it was a reminder of one's social position. Those who slept on bare beds without mattresses had no choice but to endure the constant threat of pests, disease, and discomfort. And in a world where survival was a constant battle, the idea of going to bed without any protection was an affront to one's basic human dignity. But despite these grim conditions, the common people were resourceful. Those without mattresses would often try to make their beds more comfortable by layering multiple blankets or using any other available materials to soften their sleeping surfaces. These makeshift solutions, though far from perfect, helped them endure the long nights. And even though they faced an ongoing battle with their bedding, the resilience of the lower classes in the face of adversity shines through. For many, the bed became a place not just to rest, but to fight for survival. At the other end of the spectrum, those who occupied the higher echelons of society in 18th century Europe lived with an entirely different set of anxieties related to their beds. While they had access to the finest materials and luxurious mattresses, their wealth did not exempt them from the overwhelming fears of illness and discomfort that permeated society. In fact, the grandeur of their beds may have even amplified these fears. A royal or noble bed wasn't just a place to sleep. It was an elaborate display of wealth and power, and the pressure to maintain a pristine, disease-free environment was immense. Monarchs, aristocrats, and wealthy landowners spared no expense in crafting their beds. They were surrounded by elaborate canopies, opulent drapes, and mattresses stuffed with luxurious materials, feathers, wool, and horsehair, to name a few. But despite their apparent comfort, these beds were not immune to the very real risks of disease that haunted the common people. For one thing, the luxurious fabrics and materials used in these beds were just as susceptible to dust, dirt, and pests. And even though the wealthy could afford to have their bedding regularly cleaned and maintained, the constant fear of contamination never quite went away. The idea of having an immaculate, disease-free bed was especially important for the elite, who were under constant scrutiny. Public health was becoming a topic of growing concern in Europe, and the aristocracy's lavish lifestyles were often criticized by the lower classes for their excesses. As a result, nobles were hyper-aware of the potential risks posed by their beds, even if they had the means to mitigate those risks. For example, the rich often went to great lengths to ensure their mattresses were kept in pristine condition. Special servants were often assigned the task of regularly fumigating the bedding with aromatic herbs, incense, and perfumes in an attempt to keep the bed fresh and free from unpleasant odors, pests, and germs. Historians still debate whether this obsession with cleanliness and hygiene was born out of genuine concern for health, or whether it was a symptom of the elite's anxiety about their own vulnerability. After all, despite their wealth and privilege, they were just as susceptible to illness as anyone else. The idea that illness could infiltrate their sacred private spaces, like their luxurious beds, was deeply unsettling. For some, this fear even extended to the belief that sleeping in a bed that had been previously used by someone who was ill could invite disease into their own lives. In this way, the fear surrounding beds without mattresses wasn't just about the lower classes suffering in their poverty. It was a societal-wide issue, one that transcended class and rank. The rich, with all their luxuries, were just as haunted by the possibility of disease and discomfort. The fear of an unsanitary bed crossed all social boundaries, and the bed, as a place of rest and refuge, became one of the most anxiety-ridden spaces in 18th century Europe. But let's not be fooled. Sleep in the 18th century was about much more than just avoiding pests, disease, and fire. It was also about navigating a world where the very act of lying down to rest could have profound effects on your health, mentally and physically. The lack of proper mattresses was directly tied to issues of sleep hygiene, and the absence of supportive bedding had long-lasting repercussions on the well-being of Europeans, especially the lower classes. Sleeping on straw or rag-stuffed mattresses, if they could even afford such a luxury, wasn't just uncomfortable, it was harmful. In fact, sleep hygiene was virtually non-existent for most people. Without a mattress to cushion and support the body, many suffered from poor quality sleep that left them constantly fatigued and vulnerable to illness. Poor sleep could weaken the immune system, leaving people more susceptible to infections, and it was also linked to various mental health issues. The inability to rest properly not only affected physical health, but also contributed to the general mood of unease that hung over the population. Poor sleep, combined with the stress of living in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions, was a recipe for chronic illness, both physical and mental. Historians still argue over whether the widespread fear of inadequate bedding in the 18th century was purely a response to the discomfort and poor sleep quality, or whether it was tied to the social and psychological implications of being without a proper bed. Some suggest that people of the time understood that poor sleep contributed to a host of physical ailments, while others believed that the fear of an uncomfortable bed was more rooted in class status and the fear of appearing unclean or vulnerable. One thing is certain: sleep wasn't just about rest. It was about survival. For the common folk, a night's sleep on a bare straw bed was often interrupted by physical pain. Sleeping on such hard surfaces caused backaches, joint pain, and circulation problems. The wealthy, in contrast, had the luxury of feather beds, which provided some semblance of comfort, but even they weren't immune from the broader health risks. Though the nobility had access to better materials, they still slept in a world where hygiene was far from perfect. No matter how rich you were, you could never entirely escape the psychological and physical toll that poor sleep could have on your body. The question remains, did the mattress truly protect the body, or did it merely offer a semblance of comfort in a world that was far from restful? As Europe entered the 18th century, the spread of new ideas and innovations began to influence all aspects of life, including sleep. The exchange of cultural knowledge between European nations, as well as from the East, introduced new methods of bedding, including the concept of mattresses as we know them today. Before the widespread use of mattresses, people were often confined to sleeping on harder, less comfortable surfaces. But slowly, as new materials and ideas spread, the fear of unmattressed beds began to shift. Eastern cultures, with their long histories of using padded bedding, began to make an impression on the West. In China, Japan, and India, people had been sleeping on padded mats and mattresses for centuries. These mattresses, made of cotton or other natural materials, provided comfort and protection against the cold, while also allowing for better hygiene than the straw beds commonly used in Europe. As European colonialism brought more knowledge of the East, the idea of sleeping on a mattress caught on, especially among the upper classes. At the same time, the growing demand for comfort and convenience led to the development of more advanced mattresses in Europe. Innovations in materials such as feathers, wool, and horsehair began to replace straw, and mattress making became a more specialized craft. While these changes were initially limited to the wealthier classes, over time, the idea of sleeping on a mattress spread throughout society. By the end of the 18th century, mattresses were becoming more common, even among the lower classes, though they were still considered a luxury for many. Historians still argue whether the introduction of mattresses in Europe was driven by a growing understanding of health and comfort, or whether it was merely a fashion trend that caught on with the elite. Some suggest that mattresses represented a shift in European attitudes toward health and hygiene, as the understanding of sleep and its importance to overall well-being grew. Others point out that the desire for comfort and luxury often overshadowed any concern for the practical benefits of mattresses. What is clear, however, is that mattresses played a key role in changing how people viewed their beds and how they feared them. With the introduction of mattresses, Europeans could now sleep more comfortably, but the fear of the unknown, of sleeping on something unfamiliar, still lingered. The shift from sleeping on straw to sleeping on a soft mattress didn't erase centuries of superstition or anxiety. Even with the promise of better sleep and greater comfort, many Europeans continued to view their beds as places of danger, places where illness, discomfort, and even death could strike at any moment. As the 18th century came to a close, the world began to change at an accelerating pace, and this included the way people thought about their sleep. The Industrial Revolution, which was in full swing by the late 1700s, introduced a wave of new technology that would forever alter the way beds were made, maintained, and used. The birth of mass production made its way into the world of mattresses, turning once luxurious items into more affordable commodities, and marking the beginning of the end for the age-old fear of beds without proper mattresses. With mass production came new materials, springs, coiled wires, and the use of cotton, and mattress making became a more standardized process. Instead of relying on costly handmade mattresses made from expensive materials like feathers or horsehair, mass-produced mattresses made of less expensive materials became more widely available. This innovation drastically lowered the price of mattresses, making them more accessible to the middle and even lower classes. For the first time in history, many Europeans could afford to sleep on something more comfortable than straw or cloth-stuffed sacks. This change in the bedding industry didn't just make sleep more comfortable, it drastically reduced the fear of unsanitary or dangerous beds. People were no longer forced to sleep on straw or cloth that could easily harbor pests, mold, or decay. With mass-produced mattresses, the fear of disease and contamination lessened, and people could sleep with a little more peace of mind. Historians still debate the exact impact of the Industrial Revolution on personal health and hygiene, but there's little doubt that the rise of affordable, clean bedding helped alleviate some of the widespread anxiety about sleep. Yet, even with the advancements in mattress making, the shift didn't come without its own set of fears. The mass production of mattresses also made them more ubiquitous, and with this new availability came a new set of concerns, namely, how to keep them clean. While the threat of disease was mitigated by more sanitary materials, people now had to worry about maintaining these new beds in the face of increased use. Mattresses were no longer the sole domain of the rich. They were now commonplace, but so were the issues of dirt, grime, and wear. Still, the shift toward mattresses represented a major turning point in European history. The widespread availability of mattresses, alongside the growing emphasis on hygiene and public health, marked the beginning of the end for the 18th century fears surrounding beds without proper bedding. Though mattresses would continue to evolve and change over the centuries, they began to replace the straw beds of the past, slowly eroding the anxieties that had once plagued the people of Europe. As the 19th century dawned, the Enlightenment period's influence on European thinking continued to shape how people approached the concept of sleep, health, and the body. This era was marked by a new wave of rational thinking, where ideas rooted in superstition and medieval fears were increasingly challenged by science and reason. The role of the bed, particularly the mattress, evolved during this time as well, as both a symbol of personal comfort and a reflection of society's growing understanding of hygiene and health. By this time, many European households were well into the practice of sleeping on modern mattresses, though the fears surrounding unprotected sleep had not completely vanished. The idea that a proper bed was essential for good health was becoming more widespread, thanks to growing knowledge of anatomy, sleep cycles, and the importance of rest. Doctors and scientists were beginning to understand that proper sleep was crucial for physical and mental well-being, and the bed was no longer just a place of rest. It became a space where the body's health could be nurtured or damaged. Historians still debate whether the Enlightenment truly marked the moment when Europe's fear of unmattressed beds finally dissipated, or whether the transition was more gradual. Some argue that, while scientific thinking encouraged people to view their health more critically, it also led to the rise of anxieties about cleanliness, sleep disorders, and bodily function. In other words, even as people started to view their beds as necessary for health, they also began to fear what would happen if they didn't maintain their beds to a certain standard of cleanliness. This period also saw the rise of the middle class, who had the means to invest in new, more comfortable beds, and as beds became more accessible, they became less of a symbol of luxury and more of an expectation for everyone, regardless of social class. This shift made the bed and its mattress less of a class marker and more of a universal need. With that, the pressure to maintain a clean, comfortable sleeping environment was no longer confined to the upper classes. People across Europe were now concerned about the state of their beds, but the anxiety had evolved from a fear of illness and superstition to a more modern concern about hygiene and sleep health. As people grew more attuned to the scientific importance of sleep and bodily rest, they began to see their beds as more than just places to sleep. They were sanctuaries for the body. But interestingly enough, the deeper the scientific understanding of sleep, the more complex the relationship with the bed became. Where once a mattress simply provided a cushion against the harshness of a straw-filled bed, now it was a highly curated item that required maintenance, cleaning, and even design consideration. The bed became a focal point for the new health consciousness, with people striving to optimize their sleep experience. And yet, despite all of these advances, the underlying fear of vulnerability remained. After all, the bed was still a place where we let down our guard, both physically and mentally, making us prone to rest and recuperation, but also susceptible to harm. As the 19th century progressed, the fear of beds without mattresses, once so prevalent in 18th century Europe, began to dissipate. However, the legacy of that fear didn't vanish entirely. It lingered, influencing the ways we view comfort and health even today. While advancements in materials, hygiene, and sleep science have helped eliminate the most pressing fears, we still find ourselves constantly striving to improve our sleep environments. The evolution of bedding has come a long way, but in many ways, it's a reflection of our ongoing relationship with vulnerability, health, and rest. The rise of modern, comfortable mattresses brought with it a sense of security. People no longer feared sleeping on bare, straw-filled beds that invited pests and disease. Instead, they embraced the idea of restful sleep, knowing that proper bedding could contribute to their overall well-being. But even though the mattress became a staple in homes across Europe, the anxieties surrounding sleep and rest continued to evolve. Today, the fear of unmattressed beds might seem like an ancient relic, something that no longer holds relevance in our world of memory foam and adjustable bases. But look a little deeper, and you'll see that this fear, the fear of what lurks beneath the surface, whether it's pests, illness, or the unknown, still shapes our modern approach to sleep. Think about how we constantly debate mattress types, sleep positions, and the best environment for rest. We've replaced the fear of straw with concerns about allergens, neck pain, and insomnia. The bed, once a symbol of vulnerability, has become an object of self-care and personal investment. As we continue to prioritize health, wellness, and sleep hygiene, the historical fears surrounding beds have evolved from superstition and pestilence to modern concerns about quality and comfort. Historians still argue about whether the 18th century fear of beds without mattresses was driven more by the practical need for comfort and hygiene, or by the deeper, more primal fear of vulnerability. But what is clear is that the bed, and the act of sleep, remains an area where we seek both solace and safety, whether from external threats or from the internal need for rest and rejuvenation. As we close tonight's journey, let's reflect on how far we've come, from the straw-filled, fear-ridden beds of the 18th century to the plush, mattress-driven comforts of today. Our understanding of rest, health, and vulnerability has shifted drastically. We still face fears, of course, just not the ones they had back then. Now, as you prepare to fall asleep tonight, take a moment to appreciate the comfort and safety of your own bed, knowing that generations before us battled much darker fears under the same roof. Now, as you drift into rest, let the weight of these ancient fears fade, and remember, while your bed may still be a place of vulnerability, it's also a sanctuary, a space for healing, relaxation, and renewal. Sleep well, knowing that the legacy of fear has long since passed, and that the bed beneath you is a far cry from the dangerous, pest-filled nightmares of the past.